She was locked in the jail for loving the wrong man, until the cowboy with a badge said her name. The iron bars clanged shut behind Gabriella Grant with a finality that echoed through the dusty jail cell, sealing away not just her freedom, but the naive dreams that had led her to Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1878. The small frontier town, with its single dirt road and weathered wooden buildings, had seemed like a fresh start when she'd arrived 2 months ago. Now it was her prison, and all because she'd given her heart to a man who'd used it for his own criminal gain. "You'll stay put until the circuit judge arrives next month," Sheriff Thomas barked, his thick gray mustache twitching with disapproval as he turned the key in the lock. "Aiding and abetting is a serious offense, Miss Grant. Lowell Blackwood is wanted in 3 territories." Gabriella gripped the cold metal bars, her knuckles turning white. "I didn't know about the robberies."
"I swear it, Sheriff."
"He told me he was a cattle broker." The sheriff's weathered face remained unmoved. "That's what they all say." "Should have thought about that before you let him store those stolen goods in your boarding house room." He hung the cell key on a hook by his desk and settled his considerable bulk into his chair. "A pretty face like yours wastes to see it behind bars. But the law's the law." Tears threatened, but Gabriella refused to let them fall. 24 years old, and she'd made the worst mistake of her life, allowing herself to be charmed by Lowell's handsome face and smooth words. The traveling salesman routine, the promises of marriage, and a home in San Francisco, all lies constructed to give him a respectable cover while he carried out his robberies. She retreated to the narrow cot against the wall, its thin mattress offering little comfort against the hard wooden frame. The cell was small, with just enough space for the cot, a crude wash basin, and a bucket in the corner that made her cheeks burn with humiliation at the thought of using it. A tiny barred window high on the wall let in streams of late afternoon sunlight that illuminated dancing dust motes, the only things free to move as they pleased. Gabriella smoothed her wrinkled skirts, once a pretty blue cotton, now grimy from the 2 days she'd already spent in this cell following her arrest. Her dark hair hung limp around her shoulders, having come loose from its pins during the struggle when the sheriff and his deputy had come to search her room at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. They'd found the stolen jewelry and cash hidden in a false bottom of Lowell's trunk, a trunk he'd convinced her to keep in her room, just for a few days, while he traveled to neighboring towns on business. And then he'd disappeared, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The front door of the sheriff's office swung open, bringing with it a gust of hot desert air and the sound of boot heels on the wooden floor. Gabriella didn't bother looking up, assuming it was just another curious townsperson coming to gawk at the fallen woman who'd been foolish enough to trust a criminal. "Sheriff Thomas," a deep voice said, unfamiliar, yet carrying an air of authority. "Got your telegram. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Daniel Easton." At this, Gabriella's head snapped up. A tall figure stood before the sheriff's desk, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the late afternoon light streaming through the window. He removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges. Dust covered his long coat, and a silver badge gleamed on his chest. "Marshal Easton," Sheriff Thomas said, rising from his chair and extending his hand. "Appreciate you making good time. Didn't expect you until tomorrow at least." "Rode straight through," the marshal replied, shaking the sheriff's hand firmly. "Blackwood's been slippery. When I heard you had his woman in custody, I knew this might be our best chance to find him." "His woman," Gabriella whispered bitterly, loud enough that both men turned toward her cell. She stood and approached the bars again. "I was not his woman. I was his fool." The marshal stepped closer to her cell, and Gabriella got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes were a striking blue that reminded her of the sky after a storm had cleared. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, but rather than marring his features, it somehow enhanced them, telling a story of danger survived. Mississippi, he began, searching her face with a gaze that seemed to look straight through her. Grant, Sheriff Thomas applied. Gabriella Grant. Been in town just shy of 2 months. Was working at the millinery shop until we found out she was harboring Blackwood and keeping his stolen goods. The marshal's brow furrowed as he studied her. There was something in his expression, not the judgment or contempt she'd seen from everyone else in town since her arrest, but something more complex. Gabriella Grant, he said her name slowly, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue. Something shifted in the air between them as he spoke her name. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderclap or a lightning strike, but a subtle change, like the first cool breeze after months of summer heat. For the first time since the cell door had closed behind her, Gabriella felt something other than despair. I didn't know, she said, meeting his gaze directly. Whatever you think of me, Marshal Easton, I did not know what Lowell was. If I had, I would never have. Her voice caught, and she cleared her throat. I was deceived, but I am not his accomplice. The marshal held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the sheriff. I'd like to speak with Miss Grant alone, if that's acceptable. Sheriff Thomas shrugged. Office is yours, Marshal. I've got rounds to make anyway. He gathered his hat from a hook by the door. She's all yours. Just don't let that pretty face fool you like it did me when she first came to town. Blackwood's not the first con man to use a woman as cover. When the sheriff had gone, Marshal Easton pulled a chair up to the cell and sat down, placing his hat on his knee. Up close, Gabriella could see the weariness in his face, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun and longer nights on the trail. Miss Grant, he began, his voice lower now that they were alone. I've been tracking Lowell Blackwood for the better part of a year. In that time, I've met 3 other women in situations not unlike yours. Gabriella's cheeks burned with shame. So, I'm just another in a long line of fools. That's not what I said, he replied, his tone gentler than before. What I'm saying is that Blackwood has a pattern. He chooses intelligent, respectable women who are alone in the world. Women with no family nearby to ask questions. Women who are new in town, trying to build a life for themselves. His eyes held hers steadily. Am I right? Are you alone here? Gabriella nodded slowly. My parents died of fever 5 years ago in Kansas City. I came west looking for. She trailed off, embarrassed by her own naivety. A fresh start, he finished for her. There's no shame in that. Half the people west of the Mississippi are here for the same reason. Something in his understanding tone loosened the knot in her chest that had been there since her arrest. Marshal Easton, Daniel, he corrected her. If we're going to work together, you might as well use my given name. Work together? Gabriella's hands tightened on the iron bars. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward, his blue eyes intent on hers. I need to find Blackwood, Miss Grant. And despite what the sheriff believes, I think you're my best chance of doing that. I told you I don't know where he is. He left town before the sheriff found the stolen goods. But you know him better than anyone else currently not on the wrong side of the law, Daniel countered. You spent time with him. You talked with him. He might have let things slip, places he mentioned, people he knew, plans he was making. And if I help you, what then? Gabriella asked, a flicker of hope kindling in her chest. The sheriff says I'll still face the judge for aiding and abetting. Daniel stood and moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Help me catch Blackwood, and I'll do everything in my power to see those charges dropped. He glanced toward the door to ensure they were still alone. But I need to know something first, and I need you to be honest with me, Miss Grant. Gabriella, she said softly. If I'm to call you Daniel, then it's only fair. A slight smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face for just a moment. Very well, Gabriella. I need to know for certain, did you have any knowledge of Blackwood's activities? Any suspicion at all? She met his gaze unflinchingly. I swear to you, I did not. There were things that didn't quite add up. The way he always had money despite claiming business was slow, how secretive he was about his past. But I never imagined. She swallowed hard. I thought perhaps he'd been hurt before, that he was cautious about opening up. I never suspected he was a criminal. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small key. And that's why I'm going to help you. Gabriella's heart leapt. You have a key to the cell? No, Daniel replied, slipping the key back into his pocket. But I do have authority as a U.S. Marshal to take custody of prisoners relevant to federal investigations. By tomorrow morning, you'll be out of this cell. He stepped back, picking up his hat from the chair. But you won't be free, not yet. You'll be in my custody until we find Blackwood. In your custody? Gabriella frowned. What does that mean exactly? It means you'll stay close to me while we track him down. I can't risk you running off, not when you're my best lead. His expression softened slightly at the alarm on her face. I'm not Sheriff Thomas, Gabriella. You won't be treated like a criminal. But I do need your help, and I need to know you won't disappear on me. Before she could respond, the office door opened again, and Sheriff Thomas returned. Daniel stepped away from the cell, his expression becoming professional once more. Sheriff, he said with a nod. I'll be taking Miss Grant into federal custody tomorrow morning. I'd appreciate it if you could arrange for her belongings to be brought here from wherever they're being held. The sheriff's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. You're taking her? She's scheduled for the circuit judge. Federal jurisdiction supersedes local in this case, Daniel interrupted smoothly. Blackwood's crimes cross territorial boundaries. Miss Grant is a material witness. Thomas scratched his beard, eyeing Gabriella skeptically. Your jurisdiction, your problem, I suppose. Though if you want my advice, you'll keep her locked up tight. Women like her will be handled according to federal procedure. Daniel cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll make arrangements for accommodations tonight and collect her in the morning. After the marshal left, Gabriella sat back on her cot, her mind racing. Tomorrow she would be out of this cell, but trading one form of captivity for another. Yet something about Marshal Daniel Easton made her trust him in a way she'd sworn never to trust a man again after Lowell's betrayal. Perhaps it was the way he'd said her name, like it was something to be respected rather than judged. Or maybe it was the fairness in his blue eyes when he looked at her not as a criminal or a fool, but as a person who might actually be innocent. Whatever tomorrow would bring, Gabriella knew one thing for certain. When the cowboy with the badge had said her name, everything had changed. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Daniel returned to the sheriff's office, a leather satchel in one hand and a bundle of fabric in the other. Gabriella had slept poorly, the hard cot and her anxious thoughts conspiring against arrest. She sat up quickly when she heard the door open, smoothing her hair as best she could with her fingers. Sheriff Thomas was already at his desk, looking disgruntled as he sorted through wanted posters. He barely glanced up when Daniel entered. Your prisoner's ready. Had the Wilson woman bring over her things. He nodded toward a small carpet bag sitting by his desk. Daniel nodded in acknowledgement before turning to Gabriella. I've brought you something. He approached the cell and passed the bundle of fabric through the bars. Thought you might want to change before we leave town. Gabriella unfolded the bundle to find a simple but clean dress of dark blue calico. It wasn't new. The fabric showed signs of washing, but it was free from the dirt and wrinkles that marked her current clothing. The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught her by surprise. Thank you, she said quietly, glancing up at him. But whose? Widow Holloway at the boarding house where I stayed last night, Daniel explained. She was kind enough to lend it when I explained the situation. There's a washroom through that door. He nodded toward a small door at the back of the office. Sheriff Thomas will unlock your cell so you can clean up and change. The sheriff grumbled but complied, warning Gabriella that escape would be futile with both men standing guard. The washroom was little more than a closet with a basin and pitcher of water, but to Gabriella it offered a blessed moment of privacy. She washed as thoroughly as possible with the cold water, changed into the borrowed dress, and did her best to arrange her hair into a semblance of order with the few pins she still had. When she emerged, feeling somewhat more human, she found Daniel waiting with her carpet bag in hand and paperwork spread across the sheriff's desk. "Sign here, acknowledging transfer of the prisoner," Daniel said, pointing to a line at the bottom of a document. The sheriff signed with a flourish. "She's your responsibility now, Marshal. Don't say I didn't warn you about her." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained professional. "Your concerns are noted, Sheriff. Miss Grant, if you're ready." He extended his free hand toward the door. Outside, the town was just coming to life. A few early risers moved along the boardwalks, and the smell of baking bread wafted from the direction of the small hotel. Daniel led Gabriella to where 2 horses stood hitched outside the office, his own tall bay gelding and a smaller dappled mare. "You can ride?" he asked, setting her carpetbag down. Gabriella nodded. "I grew up on a small farm." "It's been a while, but yes." "Good. We have ground to cover." He secured her bag to the mare's saddle and then, to her surprise, did not immediately move to help her mount. Instead, he turned to face her directly, his expression serious. "Before we go any further, I want to be clear about our arrangement," he said, his voice low enough that passers-by wouldn't overhear. "Legally, you're in my custody, which means you go where I go. If you try to run, I'll have no choice but to bring you back and let the law take its course." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "But I meant what I said yesterday. Help me find Blackwood, and I'll do everything in my power to see you cleared." Gabriella straightened her shoulders. "I understand. And I want him caught as much as you do, Marshal. Perhaps more." A hint of approval flickered across his face. "Then we're agreed. And it's Daniel, remember?" He offered his hand to help her mount, his grip strong and secure as she swung into the saddle. Once they were both mounted, Daniel led them out of town at an easy pace. Gabriella could feel curious eyes watching from storefronts and windows as they passed the disgraced woman and the marshal, leaving Willow Creek behind. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shame. "Where are we going?" she asked when the last building had disappeared behind them and there was nothing but open country ahead. "Silver Creek," Daniel replied, adjusting his hat against the brightening sun. "It's a mining town about 3 days' ride from here. I have reason to believe Blackwood might have connections there." "What reason?" Daniel glanced over at her, a slight smile touching his lips. "That's the first test of whether you're really going to help me, Gabriella. Does the name Silver Creek mean anything to you? Did Blackwood ever mention it?" Gabriella frowned, searching her memory. "He never mentioned it by name, no. But—" She hesitated, recalling a conversation that had seemed insignificant at the time. "He did talk about a silver mining investment. Said he had friends in the business who were letting him in on a promising claim." She looked over at Daniel. "I assumed it was just another of his lies." "It probably was," Daniel agreed. "But sometimes the best lies have a grain of truth in them. Blackwood likes to operate in mining towns, plenty of cash flowing, men striking it rich overnight, and looking for ways to spend their money. Easy marks for a con man." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a steady backdrop to Gabriella's thoughts. The open country around them was beautiful in its rugged way, vast expanses of scrubland dotted with sage and mesquite, framed by distant mountains that shimmered in the heat. "May I ask you something?" Gabriella finally said as they paused at a small stream to water the horses. Daniel looked up from where he was filling his canteen. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." She slid down from her mare, stretching her legs. "How did you become a marshal? You seem different from the other lawmen I've met. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. Different how? Gabriella felt her cheeks warm. More. I don't know. Thoughtful, perhaps. Less quick to judge. Daniel recorked his canteen and stood, his expression turning reflective. I was a soldier first. Cavalry during the war, then a few years at frontier posts afterward. He absently touched the scar on his cheekbone. Saw enough injustice to know I wanted to be on the right side of it, if I could figure out what that was. He shrugged slightly. Marshal service seemed a better fit than local law. Less politics, more independence. And how did you start tracking Lowell specifically? She asked, genuinely curious now. A shadow passed across Daniel's face. That's a longer story, one I'm not sure you'd want to hear. Because it involves another woman he deceived? Gabriella guessed, her voice quiet. Daniel met her gaze, something like respect in his eyes. You're perceptive. Yes, it involves another woman. But unlike you, she didn't survive her association with Blackwood. Gabriella felt a chill despite the warm day. He killed her. Not directly, but his actions led to her death. Daniel's jaw tightened. I was assigned to investigate. The more I learned about Blackwood, the more determined I became to bring him to justice. I'm sorry, Gabriella said softly. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy, without inviting more questions. We should keep moving if we want to make good distance before nightfall. As they continued their journey, Gabriella found herself studying the Marshal when he wasn't looking. There was more to Daniel Easton than the badge. He wore a depth of character that intrigued her despite her resolve to guard her heart. She reminded herself that her freedom depended on helping him find Lowell, nothing more. Any other interest would be as foolish as her infatuation with Blackwood had been, if not more so. Yet when Daniel turned to check on her, catching her gaze with those clear blue eyes, Gabriella felt something stir inside her that had nothing to do with their mission. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had no right to indulge. But as they rode side by side across the vast Arizona landscape, she couldn't help wondering what kind of man Daniel Easton truly was beneath his marshal's badge and careful reserve. By late afternoon, they had covered a significant distance. The terrain had gradually changed, becoming more rugged as they approached a region of rocky hills. Daniel led them off the main trail to a sheltered area near a small spring, surrounded by enough vegetation to provide grazing for the horses. We'll camp here tonight, he announced, dismounting smoothly. Gabriella slid from her mare's back, wincing slightly as her muscles protested the long hours in the saddle. Though she'd ridden in her youth, it had been years since she'd spent an entire day on horseback. Daniel noticed her discomfort. Saddle sore? A little, she admitted. Nothing serious. He nodded, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. It'll ease up after a few days. You've done well for someone who hasn't ridden regularly. The simple compliment shouldn't have pleased her as much as it did. Gabriella busied herself with unsaddling her mare to hide the small smile that touched her lips. They worked together to set up camp with an efficiency that surprised her. Daniel was clearly accustomed to life on the trail, and he explained each task briefly but clearly, treating her more like a partner than a prisoner. He showed her how to gather the right kind of wood for a small, hot, burning fire that would produce minimal smoke, and how to arrange their bedrolls to take advantage of the natural shelter provided by an overhanging rock. As darkness fell, they sat across from each other beside the small fire, sharing a simple meal of jerky, hard biscuits, and coffee. The night was clear, with a blanket of stars spreading overhead that took Gabriella's breath away. It's beautiful, she murmured, gazing upward. I'd almost forgotten how many stars there are when you get away from town lights. Daniel followed her gaze. That's one advantage of this life. You get to see the sky as it was meant to be seen. Do you ever miss it? Having a home, I mean. A place that's yours. Something crossed his face that Gabriella couldn't quite read, a flicker of old pain, perhaps, or longing. Sometimes, he admitted. But this has been my life for so long now, I'm not sure I'd know how to settle in one place. He looked at her across the fire, the flames casting his features in shifting light and shadow. What about you? What made you leave Kansas City for a small town in Arizona Territory? Gabriella stared into her tin cup of coffee. After my parents died, there was nothing left for me there. I taught at a small school for a while, but... She hesitated, memories washing over her. The fever that took my parents left me ill for months afterward. By the time I recovered, my position had been filled. I tried to find other work, but Kansas City was changing. Too many people, too few opportunities for a woman alone. So you came west. So I came west, she echoed, with enough money saved for a fresh start. I'd read about opportunities for women in the territory, shops needing clerks, schools needing teachers, even land available for those willing to homestead. She smiled ruefully. It all seemed so promising on paper. And then you met Blackwood, Daniel supplied quietly. Gabriella nodded, her smile fading. It was my second week in Willow Creek. I just secured the position at the millinery. He came in to buy a hat, said it was a gift for his sister. She shook her head at her own naivety. He was charming, well-spoken. Called on me properly. Took me to dinner at the hotel. Told me he was a cattle broker building his business, hoping to settle down soon with the right woman. And you believed him. It wasn't a question, but Gabriella answered anyway. I wanted to believe him. It's different for a woman alone, Daniel. The world isn't kind to us. The prospect of a respectable man with means, who seemed to value me for my mind as well as... She gestured vaguely at herself, embarrassed. Well, it was compelling. Daniel was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Blackwood is good at what he does, he finally said. He studies his marks, learns what they want to hear, what they need, and he becomes exactly that. His voice softened slightly. It doesn't make you a fool, Gabriella. It makes you human. The kindness in his words brought a lump to her throat that she struggled to swallow past. Thank you for that, she said quietly. But I still should have seen through him. Maybe, Daniel conceded. But beating yourself up about it won't help us catch him now. He set his empty cup aside. We should get some rest. Dawn comes early out here. As they prepared for sleep, Gabriella was acutely aware of the unusual circumstances. Here she was, miles from civilization, preparing to spend the night mere feet away from a man she barely knew. Yet strangely, she felt safer with Daniel than she had in the town jail, or even in her boarding house room after Lowell had begun visiting. Daniel seemed to sense her thoughts. I'll sleep on this side of the fire, he said, laying out his bedroll at a respectful distance. You'll be safe, Gabriella.
You have my word on that.
I know, she replied softly, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Despite having just met him, despite the fact that he was effectively her captor, she did trust that Daniel Easton would keep his word. As she settled into her bedroll, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, Gabriella wondered what the coming days would bring. The pursuit of Lowell Blackwood would undoubtedly be dangerous, but at least now she wasn't facing it alone. Whether friend, ally, or simply a fair-minded lawman, Marshal Daniel Easton had already shown her more consideration than she'd expected to find in her circumstances. With that comforting thought, she drifted into sleep, the distant howl of a coyote blending with the soft sounds of the desert night. The next 2 days fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and oddly comfortable. They rode from dawn until dusk, stopping only to rest the horses and eat quick, simple meals. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, showing Gabriella small skills that made the journey easier: how to sit in the saddle to minimize fatigue, how to read the land for signs of water, how to move quietly through brush to avoid startling wildlife. During the long hours of riding, they talked. At first, the conversations were focused entirely on Lowell, Daniel asking detailed questions about Lowell's habits, the names he'd mentioned, the places he'd claimed to have visited. Gabriella answered as thoroughly as she could, finding that even seemingly insignificant details were coming back to her now that she was actively trying to recall them. He mentioned a partner once, she told Daniel as they rode side by side through a narrow valley on the second day. Only in passing. I asked who he was negotiating a cattle sale with, and he said something about his partner handling that end of things. When I asked more, he changed the subject. Daniel looked over sharply. Did he give a name? Gabriella frowned in concentration. He didn't say a full name, but I think. Yes, he referred to him as Mac once. I assumed it was short for something. Could be. Daniel agreed, his expression thoughtful. There's a man named Mackenzie who's been connected to some of the same robberies as Blackwood. Samuel Mackenzie. Former Union soldier turned outlaw after the war. Is he dangerous? They all are, Daniel replied grimly. But Mackenzie has a reputation for being more ruthless than Blackwood. Less charming, more prone to violence when things don't go his way. Gabriella shivered despite the warm day. Lowell never seemed violent. Dishonest, yes, but not. She trailed off, remembering something. Actually, there was one time. A man at the saloon bumped into him, spilled his drink. It was clearly an accident, but the look in Lowell's eyes. She shook her head. It passed so quickly I thought I'd imagined it. But for just a moment he looked
Cold.
calculating. That sounds like the Blackwood I've been tracking, Daniel said. He keeps the violence under wraps when it suits him, but it's there beneath the surface. As they continued their journey, gradually their conversations expanded beyond Lowell Blackwood. Daniel told her stories of his time as a marshal, the vast territories he'd crossed, the strange characters he'd encountered, the moments of unexpected beauty he'd witnessed in remote places few people ever saw. In turn, Gabriella shared memories of her life before her childhood on the small Kansas farm, her parents' encouragement of her education, her brief career as a teacher. By the evening of the third day, as they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Gabriella realized that she'd come to genuinely like Daniel Easton. Behind his professional demeanor was a man of principle and unexpected depth, thoughtful, well-read despite his frontier life, and possessed of a dry humor that emerged when she least expected it. Silver Creek itself was a stark contrast to the peaceful wilderness they'd traveled through. The mining town sprawled across a valley, its buildings climbing up the hillsides that surrounded it. Even from a distance, they could hear the constant clang of machinery from the mines and the low hum of a town in perpetual motion. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and the main street was crowded with wagons, riders, and pedestrians despite the late hour. Daniel led them to a small hotel on the edge of town, away from the busiest saloons and gambling halls. "We'll stay here tonight," he said as they dismounted. "I have contacts in town I need to speak with, but it's better if we're not too visible at first." Inside, the hotel was modest but clean, with a small lobby furnished with worn but polished wooden furniture. The clerk behind the desk was a middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose, who looked up with mild interest as they entered. "Evening, folks. Need rooms for the night?" Daniel approached the desk. "Yes, 2 rooms, adjoining if possible." The clerk looked between them, taking in Gabriella's travel-worn appearance and Daniel's dusty clothes, his gaze lingering on the marshal's badge. "Only got 1 room available at present, Marshal. Mining companies got surveyors in town, taken most of my rooms." Daniel frowned. "No other options?" "Afraid not. Got the Blue Goose Hotel down the street, but it's above their saloon. Not a place for a lady." The clerk's gaze slid to Gabriella again, with a hint of question in his eyes. Daniel seemed to make a decision. "We'll take the 1 room then." He placed coins on the counter. "And we'll need hot water sent up if you'd be so kind." The clerk nodded, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 4, top of the stairs. I'll have the boy bring up water directly." As they climbed the narrow staircase, Gabriella's heart beat faster with uncertainty. She trusted Daniel. These past days had confirmed that, but sharing a room was an intimacy she hadn't anticipated. The room itself was small but adequate, with a double bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a painted screen in one corner. Daniel set their bags down and immediately addressed the awkwardness. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said matter-of-factly. "Once the water comes, I'll step out so you can wash up and change in privacy." Relief and a strange disappointment mingled in Gabriella's chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being a gentleman about this." A knock at the door announced the arrival of hot water. While a young boy brought in 2 large pitchers and a copper tub that he set behind the screen, Daniel explained their plans for the evening. "I need to meet a contact at one of the saloons," he said once they were alone again. "Someone who might have information about Blackwood or Mackenzie. You should stay here, rest. Lock the door behind me." Gabriella frowned. "Wouldn't I be more useful with you? If Lowell is in town, I could identify him." "Too risky." Daniel shook his head. "If Blackwood is here and sees you with me, he'll vanish before we can get close. Better for me to gather information first." He hesitated, then added, "Besides, I'd rather not expose you to the kind of establishments I'll be visiting tonight." She lifted her chin slightly. "I'm not as sheltered as you might think, Marshal." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt your fortitude, Gabriella. But my job is to keep you safe while we track Blackwood. Let me do that." After Daniel left, Gabriella gratefully used the hot water to wash away days of trail dust. The simple pleasure of being clean again lifted her spirits tremendously. She changed into her nightgown and robe, then sat by the window, watching the town's activity below while combing out her damp hair. Silver Creek was alive with light and noise. Piano music drifted from the saloons, mingling with shouts, laughter, and the occasional angry voice. It was a town of men seeking fortune, spending their earnings as quickly as they made them, living for today because tomorrow in the mines was never guaranteed. She wondered if Lowell was out there somewhere in those brightly lit establishments. The thought no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, she felt a cold determination. He had used her, lied to her, left her to face punishment for his crimes. She wanted him brought to justice, not just for her sake, but for all the women he had deceived. It was past midnight when Daniel returned. Gabriella had dozed off in the chair by the window and started awake at the sound of his key in the lock. He entered quietly, looking tired but alert. "Any news?" she asked, straightening in the chair. Daniel removed his hat and coat, hanging them on a hook by the door. "Maybe. Mackenzie was definitely here, left about a week ago. Heading south, according to my source. And Lowell? No confirmed sightings, but there's a man matching his description who's been seen at one of the higher-stakes poker games in town. He calls himself Lawrence Bentley." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking weary. "I'll check it out tomorrow night. These games are exclusive, need an invitation or a lot of money to get in." Gabriella wrapped her robe more tightly around herself, suddenly aware of her state of undress. "How will you manage that?" "I have resources," Daniel said with a slight smile. "Part of being a marshal is knowing how to move in different circles when needed." He glanced at the bed, which Gabriella had left untouched. "You should get some sleep. Take the bed I've made do with worse than a floor many times. At least take one of the pillows and the extra blanket," she insisted, gathering them for him. As she handed them over, their fingers brushed briefly. A jolt of awareness passed through Gabriella at the contact, and she quickly stepped back, hoping the dim lamplight hid the color that rose to her cheeks. If Daniel noticed her reaction, he gave no sign of it. He simply thanked her and set about making a pallet on the floor, his movements efficient and practiced. Gabriella slipped into the bed, turning to face the wall to give him privacy as he prepared for sleep. The sheets were clean but rough, the mattress firmer than she was used to, but after 3 nights sleeping on the ground, it felt luxurious. "Gabriella, Daniel's voice came softly through the darkness after he'd extinguished the lamp. Yes, if it is Blackwood tomorrow night. He paused. I want you to be prepared. Confronting him won't be easy for you. She considered this. I know, but I need to see this through, Daniel. For my own peace of mind, if nothing else. I understand that. Just. Another pause. Be careful with your expectations. Men like Blackwood, they don't feel remorse the way normal people do. Whatever he says when cornered, remember who he really is. The concern in his voice warmed something inside her. I will, she promised. And Daniel, thank you for believing me when no one else did. In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression, but she heard the sincerity in his quiet reply. Get some rest, Gabriella. Tomorrow could be a long day. As sleep began to claim her, Gabriella realized that somewhere in the past few days, Daniel Easton had become more than just the marshal who'd taken her from jail. He'd become someone she trusted, someone whose good opinion mattered to her. It was a dangerous realization for a woman in her position, but as she drifted off, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Daniel had already arranged for clean clothing to be delivered to their room, a simple but elegant dark green dress for Gabriella that fit her surprisingly well, and a black suit for himself that transformed him from trail-worn lawman to something closer to a prosperous businessman. How did you manage this? Gabriella asked, running her hands over the fine wool of the dress. Silver Creek has a surprisingly good dressmaker, Daniel replied, adjusting his string tie in the small mirror above the washstand. Mining towns attract all sorts. Men strike it rich and want to spend their money, which means businesses that cater to fine tastes can thrive here. But how did you know my size? A slight flush colored his cheeks. I guessed. The dressmaker helped with the details. He cleared his throat. You'll need to look the part tonight if we're going to get into that poker game. The women there will be well dressed. Gabriella's eyebrows rose. I'm coming with you? I thought you said it was too dangerous. That was before I confirmed Blackwood's presence, Daniel said, turning to face her. My contact saw him clearly last night. It's definitely him, using the Bentley alias. And you're my best chance of getting close without raising his suspicions. He hesitated. But if you're not comfortable with the plan, I understand. What exactly is the plan? Gabriella asked, her pulse quickening at the thought of facing Lowell again. Daniel outlined it as they shared a late breakfast in their room. They would pose as a wealthy couple passing through town, Daniel as a successful rancher from Colorado Territory looking to invest in mining ventures, Gabriella as his wife. His contact had secured them an invitation to the private poker game at the Grand Palace Hotel, where Lawrence Bentley had been playing nightly. We'll arrive separately, Daniel explained. I'll go in first, establish myself at the tables. You'll come in about an hour later, as if you've been shopping or visiting friends. It's common for wives to join their husbands later in the evening at these establishments. And when I see Lowell? Gabriella asked, her mouth suddenly dry. You give me a signal, we'll establish something subtle. Then you keep him distracted while I position myself to make the arrest. Daniel's blue eyes held hers steadily. It's risky, Gabriella. He knows you. If he recognizes you before we're ready. He won't, she said with more confidence than she felt. Lowell saw what he wanted to see, a naive, trusting woman easily manipulated. He never really looked beyond that. She smoothed the fabric of her new dress. Besides, he wouldn't expect to see me here, especially not dressed like this. And certainly not working with a marshal. Daniel studied her face. You're sure about this? Once we start, there's no turning back. Gabriella nodded firmly. I'm sure. I want to see him face justice, Daniel. I need to. The rest of the day passed in careful preparation. Daniel taught Gabriella the basics of their cover story, enough details to sound convincing without being so complex she might trip herself up. They practiced the signal she would use when she spotted Lowell, a specific way of touching her earring that would look natural but be unmistakable to Daniel. As evening approached, Gabriella found herself growing increasingly nervous. The thought of seeing Lowell again, the man who had charmed her, deceived her, and abandoned her to face punishment for his crimes, made her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Daniel seemed to sense her unease as they prepared to leave their room. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, standing behind her as she made a final adjustment to her hair in the mirror. "I can find another way." Their eyes met in the reflection. Gabriella was struck by how different he looked in his fine suit, his usually windblown hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He was handsome in a way that made her heart beat faster, but it was the concern in his eyes that truly moved her. "I want to do this," she said, turning to face him. "I need to face him, Daniel. Not just for you to catch him, but for myself. To look him in the eye knowing exactly what he is." Daniel nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Just remember, no risks. If anything feels wrong, you find a way to signal me, and we abort the plan. Your safety comes first." "And yours," she replied softly. For a moment, they stood close enough that Gabriella could detect the clean scent of soap and a hint of shaving tonic. Something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that somewhere in their journey from Willow Creek to Silver Creek, they had become more than marshal and prisoner, more than reluctant allies. Daniel broke the moment first, stepping back and clearing his throat. "I should go. Remember, wait an hour, then come to the Grand Palace. Ask for the private gaming room." After he left, Gabriella sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm her racing thoughts. In a few hours, she would face the man who had nearly ruined her life. And alongside her would be the man who, against all odds, had begun to restore her faith in human decency. The Grand Palace Hotel lived up to its name, at least by frontier standards. The building stood 3 stories tall, its facade painted a bright white that gleamed in the light from ornate gas lamps flanking the entrance. Inside, the lobby featured red velvet furniture, gilded mirrors, and a polished marble-topped reception desk. Gabriella entered with her head held high, channeling the confidence of the wealthy rancher's wife she was pretending to be. The clerk directed her to the private gaming room on the 2nd floor with a respectful nod, clearly impressed by her fine dress and composed demeanor. The gaming room was thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of male voices. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over green felt-covered tables where serious-faced men hunched over cards and chips. Well-dressed women circulated throughout, some wives of the players, others clearly employed by the establishment to keep the gentlemen entertained and drinking. Gabriella scanned the room, her heart pounding. She spotted Daniel at a table near the center, playing cards with 4 other men. He glanced up as if sensing her presence, giving her a barely perceptible nod before returning his attention to his hand. And then she saw him. Lowell Blackwood, or Lawrence Bentley as he was calling himself here, sat at a table in the far corner. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a polished way, with dark hair slicked back from his forehead, a meticulously trimmed mustache, and the confident smile that had once made her heart flutter. Now, seeing him again, Gabriella felt nothing but cold contempt. This was the man who had used her, who had hidden stolen goods in her room and left her to face the consequences while he escaped. The man whose actions had led to another woman's death, according to Daniel. Taking a deep breath, Gabriella made her way across the room, stopping briefly to exchange pleasantries with a few ladies, playing her role to perfection. She positioned herself where Lowell would eventually notice her, but didn't approach him directly. It took less than 10 minutes. She felt his gaze before she saw him look up, felt the weight of his attention as recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. She pretended not to notice, laughing delicately at something one of the other women said, but her heart raced with the knowledge that he had seen her. When she finally allowed herself to glance in his direction, Lowell was staring at her openly, confusion and wariness battling with curiosity on his face. She held his gaze for a moment, then deliberately touched her earring the signal to Daniel before looking away as if dismissing him. From the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel acknowledge the signal with a subtle movement of his hand. The plan was in motion. Now she needed to keep Lowell's attention focused on her until Daniel could position himself. She didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, Lowell had excused himself from his game and was making his way toward her, his expression a carefully composed mask of casual interest. "Excuse me, madam," he said smoothly as he approached. "I believe we may have met before. Perhaps in Denver." Gabriella turned to him with a practiced smile, channeling every ounce of composure she possessed. "I don't believe so, sir. I would remember." Lowell studied her face intently. "My mistake then. You remind me of someone I once knew. Lawrence Bentley, at your service." He extended his hand. "Margaret Easton," Gabriella replied, using the alias she and Daniel had agreed upon. She placed her hand in his briefly, fighting the revulsion that threatened to show on her face. "My husband and I are just passing through Silver Creek on our way to California." "Your husband?" Lowell's gaze darted around the room. "Daniel Easton. He's at one of the poker tables." She gestured vaguely, careful not to draw attention directly to Daniel. "We own a cattle ranch in Colorado Territory." Recognition flickered in Lowell's eyes, not of Daniel, but of her. "Forgive my forwardness, Mrs. Easton, but are you quite certain we haven't met? Perhaps in Arizona Territory? Willow Creek, maybe?" Gabriella's heart pounded, but she kept her expression pleasant. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Bentley. This is my first visit to this part of the country." Lowell leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Gabriella? Gabriella Grant? What game are you playing at?" Before she could respond, Daniel appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist with a familiarity that sent an unexpected thrill through her. "Darling, aren't you going to introduce me to your new acquaintance?" he asked, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard as they fixed on Lowell. Lowell straightened, wariness replacing the confusion on his face. "Lawrence Bentley," he said, extending his hand to Daniel. "I was just remarking to your wife how familiar she looks." "Is that so?" Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Daniel Easton. And I'm afraid I'm quite possessive of my wife's attention, Mr. Bentley." The tension between the two men was palpable. Gabriella could feel Lowell's growing suspicion, could see the calculations happening behind his eyes as he tried to make sense of her presence with this stranger. "Perhaps we could continue our conversation in a more private setting," Daniel suggested, his tone still cordial, but with an edge that wasn't there before. "I understand you're a man with significant mining interests. I might be looking to invest." It was a gamble offering Lowell a reason to separate from the crowd, a lure that might appeal to his greed. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse, his gaze darting between them with increasing wariness. Then he smiled, a predator's smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Easton. The hotel has private parlors for just such discussions. Shall we?" Daniel nodded, keeping his arm firmly around Gabriella's waist as they followed Lowell from the gaming room. Gabriella could feel the tension in Daniel's body, knew he was ready to move at the first sign of trouble. Lowell led them down a corridor to a small parlor furnished with leather chairs and a writing desk. As soon as the door closed behind them, his demeanor changed completely. "What the hell is this, Gabriella?" he demanded, all pretense of civility gone. "Last I heard, you were in jail in Willow Creek. And you'd know all about that, wouldn't you, Lowell?" she replied, her own mask dropping. "Since you're the one who put me there." Lowell's gaze shifted to Daniel, suspicion hardening into certainty. "You're not a rancher."
Who are you really?
In one fluid motion, Daniel drew his pistol from beneath his jacket and leveled it at Lowell's chest. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Daniel Easton. Lowell Blackwood, you're under arrest for theft, fraud, and suspicion of murder across 3 territories." Lowell's face darkened with rage as he looked from the gun to Gabriella. You're working with the law now? After everything we shared. We shared nothing but lies, Lowell, Gabriella said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. You used me as a shield for your crimes, then left me to pay the price. Turn around slowly and put your hands behind your back, Daniel ordered, producing a pair of handcuffs from his pocket. For a moment, it seemed Lowell might comply. Then, with a speed that caught them both by surprise, he lunged toward a side door Gabriella hadn't noticed, throwing himself through it before Daniel could react. Stay here, Daniel shouted to Gabriella as he rushed after Lowell. But Gabriella had come too far to be left behind now. She followed, heart pounding, as Daniel chased Lowell down a service corridor and into the kitchen at the back of the hotel. Cooks and servers scattered, shouting in alarm as the two men crashed through their workspace. Lowell knocked over a table of dishes, sending glass and porcelain shattering across the floor to slow Daniel's pursuit. He burst through the back door into an alley, Daniel only steps behind him. Gabriella reached the door just in time to see Lowell turn and swing a piece of firewood at Daniel's head. Daniel ducked, the wood missing him by inches, and tackled Lowell to the ground. The two men grappled in the dirt, each fighting for advantage. Lowell was surprisingly strong, but Daniel had the training and experience of a lawman. He pinned Lowell face down, pressing a knee into his back as he secured the handcuffs around his wrists. Lowell Blackwood, Daniel said, breathing hard from the exertion. You're under arrest. You have a long list of charges to answer for. Lowell turned his head, his face contorted with fury as he spotted Gabriella standing in the doorway. You'll regret this, he spat. Both of you. Daniel hauled him to his feet. The only one with regrets here is you, Blackwood. Your days of conning innocent women are over. As Daniel marched Lowell back through the hotel and out to the street, where curious onlookers had already begun to gather, Gabriella followed at a distance. A complex mix of emotions washed through her relief that Lowell was finally captured, satisfaction at seeing him in handcuffs, and a strange sense of closure that she hadn't expected to feel so soon. By the time they reached the Silver Creek jail, word had spread through town that a U.S. Marshal had captured a wanted man. The local sheriff, a barrel-chested man with a walrus mustache, was waiting for them. Heard you caught yourself a slippery one, Marshal, he said, eyeing Lowell with professional interest. Got a cell ready for him. Much obliged, Sheriff, Daniel replied. He'll need to be held until I can arrange transport to the territorial capital for trial. As the sheriff took custody of Lowell, leading him back to the cells, Lowell turned one last time to look at Gabriella. I loved you, you know, he said, his voice suddenly soft, persuasive. In my way. It could have been real between us. Gabriella met his gaze steadily. No, Lowell. It was never real. And I think that's the saddest part. You don't even know what real love looks like. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps genuine regret, or simply anger at being bested. Then the sheriff pulled him away, and he was gone. Daniel touched Gabriella's elbow gently. Let's go, he said quietly. There's nothing more for you here. Outside, the night air was cool and clean after the stuffiness of the jail. They walked in silence back toward their hotel, the events of the evening settling around them like dust after a storm. Are you all right? Daniel finally asked as they reached the hotel entrance. Gabriella considered the question carefully. Yes, she said, realizing it was true. Better than I expected to be, actually. Seeing him in custody, knowing he can't hurt anyone else. She shook her head slightly. It feels like I can finally close that chapter of my life. Daniel's expression softened. You were brave tonight, Gabriella. Not many people would have faced down someone who betrayed them like that. I had good reason to be brave, she replied, meeting his gaze. And good company. Something shifted in Daniel's eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been carefully hidden. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it, holding the door open for her instead. As they climbed the stairs to their room, Gabriella was acutely aware that their mission was completed. Lowell was captured. The arrangement that had brought them together was effectively concluded. What would happen now? Inside their room, Daniel removed his jacket and tie, looking more like himself without the trappings of their charade. "I'll need to make arrangements tomorrow," he said, his back to her as he hung his clothes. "For Blackwood's transport and for your return to Willow Creek." "My return?" Gabriella's heart sank. "To face the charges there?" Daniel turned to her, surprise evident on his face. "No, of course not. To clear your name. I told you I'd ensure the charges were dropped, and I meant it. Your assistance tonight was instrumental in capturing Blackwood." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by a different kind of uncertainty. "And after that? What happens after my name is cleared?" Daniel's expression grew careful, measured. "That would be up to you, Gabriella. You'd be free to go wherever you choose, start over again, if that's what you want." "Is that what you want?" The words escaped before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing, his blue eyes searching hers. Then he took a step toward her, closing some of the distance between them. "What I want," he said slowly, "is something I have no right to ask for. Not while you're technically in my custody. Not while your future is still uncertain." Gabriella's heart beat faster. "Ask anyway," she whispered. Daniel took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I want to know you better, Gabriella Grant," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not as a marshal and a witness. Not as captor and captive. But as a man and a woman who might have met under different circumstances, who might have had time to discover what lies between them without the shadow of duty hanging over everything." Gabriella felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling so different from what she'd experienced with Lowell that it was almost unrecognizable as the same emotion. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like that very much, Daniel Easton." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, warming, illuminating. He raised a hand to gently touch her cheek, the gesture tentative, asking permission. Gabriella leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the simple pleasure of it. When she opened them again, Daniel was watching her with such tenderness that it nearly took her breath away. "May I?" he asked, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips. In answer, Gabriella rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, both of them navigating this new territory with care. Then Daniel's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing held in check for too long. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since Silver Creek came into view," he admitted with a slight smile. "Only since then?" Gabriella teased, her hands resting lightly on his chest. His smile widened. "Maybe since you stood up to Sheriff Thomas back in Willow Creek. Or when you kept pace with me on the trail, without complaint. Or when you told me your story, and I saw the strength it took for you to start over after losing everything." "So long," she murmured, touched by his words. "Too long," he agreed, pressing another brief kiss to her lips. "But we have time now. Time to do things properly." Gabriella nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. Despite the attraction between them, despite the emotional connection that had grown during their journey, Daniel was too honorable to take advantage of their situation. Until she was officially free, until the charges against her were formally dropped, they would proceed with caution. It was one more reason to trust him, one more confirmation that what she was feeling was so different from her infatuation with Lowell. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked, not moving from the circle of his arms. "Tomorrow I send telegrams to Willow Creek and the Territorial Marshal's office. Once I have confirmation that the charges against you are dropped, we can discuss what comes next." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Where you might want to go. What you might want to do. And what about you? Will you continue tracking outlaws across the territories? A thoughtful expression crossed Daniel's face. I've been considering a change, actually. There's talk of establishing a permanent marshal's office in Prescott. Less traveling, more building something lasting. His eyes met hers. It's just talk for now, but it's a possibility, Gabriella finished for him. Yes. His smile was soft, hopeful. A possibility. As they prepared for sleep that night, Daniel still insisting on taking the floor despite Gabriella's protest that the bed was large enough to share. If they were careful, there was a new ease between them, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. Lying in the darkness, listening to Daniel's steady breathing, Gabriella reflected on the strange path that had led her here. From imprisonment in Willow Creek to freedom in Silver Creek. From the betrayal of one man to the beginning of trust with another. She had come west seeking a fresh start, and despite the detours and dangers, perhaps she had found it after all not in a place, but in the promise of a future that suddenly seemed brighter than she could have imagined. 1 month later, Gabriella stood on the platform of the Prescott train station, watching as passengers disembarked from the newly arrived train from Phoenix. The territorial capital had been hot and crowded, but her testimony at Lowell Blackwood's trial had been worth the discomfort. Seeing him sentenced to 15 years in a territorial prison for his crimes had provided the final closure she needed. Now, as she scanned the faces of the arriving passengers, her heart leapt at the sight of the tall figure in a marshal's coat stepping down from the train. Daniel spotted her immediately, his face breaking into a smile that still made her breath catch. "Welcome back," she said as he reached her, resisting the urge to throw her arms around him in public. They were still navigating the proper boundaries of their relationship, especially in a town where Daniel was establishing himself professionally. "It's good to be back," he replied, his eyes saying what propriety prevented him from expressing physically. "How was your week?" "Productive," Gabriella said as they began walking together toward the center of town. "The school board was very receptive to my application. It seems they're desperate for a qualified teacher for the fall term." Daniel's smile widened. "I told you they would be." Prescott's growing faster than its institutions can keep up. They're lucky to have someone with your experience. The past month had brought significant changes for both of them. True to his word, Daniel had secured a position with the newly established Marshal's office in Prescott, trading his life on the trail for more settled work coordinating law enforcement across the northern Arizona territory. Gabriella, her name fully cleared and her confidence restored, had decided to return to teaching, applying for a position at Prescott's expanding school. They reached the small house Daniel had rented on the outskirts of town, a modest place with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small parlor. It wasn't much, but it represented something neither of them had had in years, a home. "I have something for you," Daniel said once they were inside, reaching into his coat pocket. "A gift from Phoenix." He handed her a small box wrapped in brown paper. Gabriella unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful silver locket on a delicate chain. "Daniel, it's lovely," she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty, waiting for memories to fill it. "I thought you might like it," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she rarely heard. "But there's something else. Something I've been wanting to ask you." Gabriella looked up from the locket to find Daniel watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "These past weeks, sharing this house as friends, building our lives in Prescott. It's been wonderful. But I find myself wanting more, Gabriella." "More," she echoed, her mouth suddenly dry. Daniel took her hands in his, the locket nestled between their palms. "I want to court you properly. No more pretending to be married like we did in Silver Creek. No more careful distance because of who we were to each other when we met. I want to walk down the street with you on my arm and have everyone know that I am the luckiest man in the Arizona territory because Gabriella Grant has chosen to give me a chance." Joy bubbled up inside her, bright and effervescent. "Daniel Easton," she said, her voice warm with emotion. "Are you asking my permission to court me?" "I am," he confirmed, a smile tugging at his lips. "Though I admit it's been some time since I've done this sort of thing. I may be out of practice." Gabriella squeezed his hands. "Your practice seems perfectly adequate to me, Marshal." She stepped closer, propriety forgotten in the privacy of their home. "And my answer is yes. Emphatically yes." The kiss they shared then was a promise of patience, of growing affection, of a future built on mutual respect and understanding rather than deception or duty. Later, as they sat together on the small porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, Gabriella reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever think about how strangely our paths crossed?" she asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "If not for Lowell, if not for my arrest, we might never have met." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking her arm. "I've thought about that," he admitted. "And while I would spare you the pain of what you went through, I can't regret that it led you to me." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Perhaps some good can come even from our worst mistakes." "It wasn't all a mistake," Gabriella mused. "Coming west, seeking a new beginning that was the right choice, even if the path was more difficult than I expected." "And now?" Daniel asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "Is this what you want?"
Prescott?
"Teaching? This life we're building?" Gabriella turned to look at him, at the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "Yes," she said simply. "This is exactly what I want." The smile that spread across Daniel's face was like sunlight breaking through clouds. He leaned forward to kiss her gently, a kiss full of tenderness and promise. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Gabriella Grant found herself exactly where she belonged, not behind iron bars, not running from her past, but here, with a man who had said her name that day in Willow Creek and changed her life forever. Epilogue: 5 years later, the schoolhouse bell rang, signaling the end of the day's lessons. Gabriella Easton gathered her books and papers as her students rushed to collect their things, eager to begin their weekend. "Remember, your essays are due on Monday," she called over the commotion. 2 pages on the history of the Arizona Territory. A chorus of acknowledgments, some more enthusiastic than others, followed her students out the door. Gabriella smiled as she watched them go, taking particular note of 8-year-old Victoria Easton, her dark hair in 2 neat braids as she chatted animatedly with her best friend. "Mrs. Easton?" A small voice drew her attention to a boy lingering by her desk. "I might need help with my essay. Pa can't read too good, and Ma's busy with the new baby." Gabriella's expression softened. "Of course, Jimmy. Come by our house tomorrow afternoon. I'll help you get started." The boy's face brightened. "Thank you, madam." He darted out the door, nearly colliding with a tall figure entering the schoolhouse. "Whoa there, young man," Daniel Easton said with a laugh, steadying the boy with a hand on his shoulder. "Where's the fire?" "Sorry, Marshal Easton," Jimmy called over his shoulder, already running to catch up with his friends. Daniel shook his head in amusement as he approached his wife's desk. At 35, the years had added a few more lines around his eyes and a touch of silver at his temples, but he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had first drawn Gabriella to him. "Busy day?" he asked, leaning down to kiss her cheek. The usual Friday restlessness," Gabriella replied, gathering the last of her papers. "They're more interested in their weekend plans than the founding of Prescott." "Can't blame them there," Daniel said with a smile. "Speaking of weekend plans, Victoria is already talking about the picnic tomorrow. I passed her on my way here, giving Mrs. Henderson a detailed account of the pie you're baking." Gabriella laughed. "That child knows more about my plans than I do sometimes." She glanced around the empty schoolroom. "Where is she now?" Mrs. Henderson invited her to stay for dinner. Her Sarah wants to show Victoria their new kittens. Daniel took Gabriella's books from her arms. I told her we'd collect her after supper, which means... His voice lowered suggestively. We have the house to ourselves for a few hours. A pleasant warmth spread through Gabriella at his tone. 5 years of marriage had done nothing to diminish the spark between them. If anything, their connection had only deepened with time and shared experiences. Marshal Easton, she said, affecting a scandalized tone, are you suggesting we take advantage of our daughter's absence in an improper manner? Daniel's blue eyes twinkled. I believe I am, Mrs. Easton.
What do you say to that?
In answer, Gabriella reached up to pull his head down for a proper kiss, one that lingered with promise. I say we should hurry home, she murmured against his lips. Their house, once a small rental, was now their own, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. As they walked the familiar streets of Prescott, Daniel's arm around Gabriella's waist, they exchanged greetings with townspeople who had long since accepted them as fixtures of the community. Daniel's position as the senior marshal had brought stability and respect. Gabriella's role as teacher had given her purpose and connection. Together, they had built a life that neither could have imagined that day in Willow Creek when their paths first crossed. At home, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of their bedroom, Daniel held Gabriella close, his fingers tracing patterns on the bare skin of her back. Happy? He asked, a question he still posed occasionally, as if to reassure himself that the life they'd built together was real. Gabriella propped herself up on an elbow to look at him, taking in the face she had loved for 5 years and would love for many more to come. Completely, she assured him. Are you? Daniel's smile was answer enough, but he elaborated anyway. More than I ever thought possible. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I am that you were locked in that jail cell when I arrived in Willow Creek, that I saw you standing there and said your name. Gabriella Grant, she recited softly, remembering the moment. You said it like you were trying to memorize it. I was, he admitted. Even then, something about you caught me. I just didn't know yet how completely you would change my life. Gabriella leaned down to kiss him, pouring 5 years of love and gratitude into the gesture. For the better, I hope, she murmured against his lips. For the better, Daniel agreed, pulling her closer. Definitely for the better. Later, as they walked hand in hand to collect their daughter, the setting sun painted Prescott in shades of gold and amber. Gabriella squeezed Daniel's hand, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led them here from a jail cell in Willow Creek to this moment of perfect contentment. She had come west seeking a fresh start, never imagining that she would find it in the eyes of a cowboy with a badge who had said her name and set her free in more ways than one. The wrong man had led her to the right one, and for that, ironically, she could almost be grateful. As they approached the Hendersons' house, Victoria burst through the door, running to meet them with the boundless energy of childhood. Daniel scooped her up, twirling her around as she giggled with delight.
Papa.
Mrs. Henderson's kittens can open their eyes now. Can we get one, please? Daniel looked to Gabriella with raised eyebrows, silently deferring the decision to her. Gabriella laughed at their matching, hopeful expressions. We'll discuss it tomorrow, she promised, reaching out to straighten Victoria's rumpled dress. For now, it's time to head home. You need your rest if we're having that picnic tomorrow. As they walked back through the twilit streets of Prescott, Victoria between them holding both their hands, occasionally swinging forward with squeals of laughter, Gabriella caught Daniel's gaze over their daughter's head. The love she saw there was as steady and true as it had been from the beginning, a love built on respect, understanding, and the kind of deep connection that comes from seeing each other at their most vulnerable and choosing each other anyway. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she first came west, but it was better than anything she could have dreamed. A loving husband, a beautiful daughter, a home, a community, Meaningful work all because a marshal with integrity had believed in her innocence when no one else would. All because the cowboy with a badge had said her name, and everything had changed.